He prepared for endless deprivation with a clarity born not of optimism, but of long exposure to loss. Preparation was no longer a proactive act. It was a defensive reflex shaped by years of shrinking expectations. Every calculation he made assumed absence of food, of fuel, of rest, of reassurance. The future, as he understood it, was not something to be shaped, only something to be endured. He learned to measure life not by progress but by how slowly it deteriorated. Scarcity was no longer an emergency condition. It had become the operating environment in which all decisions were made. This mindset did not emerge suddenly. It formed gradually, layer by layer, as familiar systems collapsed and temporary shortages hardened into permanent realities. What once felt unthinkable became routine. Meals grew smaller, then irregular, then symbolic. Clothing was repaired until fabric itself lost integrity. Tools were reused beyond their intended lifespan, and human bodies followed the same logic, pushed past limits because there were no alternatives. Planning ceased to involve improvement. It focused instead on delay, delaying hunger, delaying illness, delaying exhaustion, delaying the moment when endurance itself would fail. Psychologically, this preparation required a quiet but profound recalibration. Hope was not abandoned dramatically, it was rationed. To hope too much was to risk emotional collapse when reality inevitably contradicted expectation. Survival demanded emotional discipline as strict as any material rationing. He learned to narrow his imagination, to think in days instead of months, hours instead of days. Long-term thinking felt indulgent, even dangerous. In a world defined by war, long-term visions were liabilities that invited disappointment. Around him, the environment reinforced this worldview. Infrastructure showed visible signs of fatigue, roads fractured, buildings scarred, transport slowed to a crawl. The landscape itself appeared to mirror human exhaustion. There were fewer signs of movement, fewer markers of continuity. Each passing season arrived with less ceremony, stripped of anticipation. Winter was no longer feared because of its cold alone, but because it intensified every existing hardship. Summer no longer promised relief, only a different configuration of struggle. The systems that once sustained civilian life had eroded into fragments. Supply chains failed unpredictably, communication faltered, and authority felt distant and abstract. Instructions arrived too late or not at all. Responsibility flowed downward, accumulating on individuals who had neither the resources nor the power to change outcomes. In this vacuum, preparation for deprivation became a form of autonomy. If one could not control events, one could at least control expectations. Preparing for the worst offered a small but tangible sense of order. This preparation was methodical. Inventories were taken repeatedly, not because supplies changed, but because certainty itself had value. Objects were assigned emotional weight based on their utility. A piece of bread, a scrap of metal, a bit of cloth, each became a strategic asset. Waste was not immoral, it was unthinkable. Every action was evaluated through the lens of future scarcity. Even rest was calculated, weighed against the risk of weakness later. The body became another resource to be managed carefully, despite the irony that it was being depleted by the very conditions that demanded its endurance. Social relationships also changed under this logic. Conversations became practical, restrained, focused on information rather than emotion. Expressions of fear or longing felt indulgent. Sympathy was present but muted, as if acknowledging pain too openly might amplify it beyond control. Solidarity existed, but it was shaped by caution. Helping others meant dividing already insufficient resources, a moral calculation made harder by the absence of reassurance that help would ever be reciprocated or replaced. The war framed all of this not as tragedy, but as necessity. Deprivation was explained as the cost of survival, the price of resistance, the unavoidable tax imposed by history. Over time, these explanations lost their explanatory power and became background noise. What remained was the daily reality of adaptation. People did not debate whether deprivation was justified. They simply adjusted to it. Preparedness replaced protest. Endurance replaced expectation. Within this atmosphere, the idea of external help seemed almost irrelevant. Assistance belonged to an earlier phase of the war, when alliances felt active and promises felt tangible. Now, distance, geographical and psychological, separated those enduring deprivation from those with the capacity to alleviate it. The war had taught him that waiting for intervention was futile. Preparation for endless deprivation was, paradoxically, the most rational response to prolonged uncertainty. This rationality, however, came at a cost. It narrowed moral vision. When survival becomes the primary objective, broader ethical considerations recede. Decisions are made quickly, based on immediate necessity rather than long-term consequence. The line between resilience and resignation blurs. Endurance begins to resemble acceptance, and acceptance begins to resemble inevitability. He did not believe deprivation was just, but he no longer believed it was temporary either. Memory itself adjusted to this new reality. Past comforts felt unreal, exaggerated by distance. It was difficult to remember abundance without questioning whether it had ever truly existed. Nostalgia offered no relief, it only highlighted contrast. The future, stripped of promise, felt abstract. What mattered was the present moment and its demands. Preparation for endless deprivation anchored him in this present, grounding him in routines that minimized surprise. Yet beneath this disciplined exterior, tension accumulated. The human mind is not designed to sustain indefinite constraint without consequence. Even as he prepared for ongoing loss, a part of him resisted the idea that deprivation was permanent. This resistance did not take the form of hope, but of vigilance. He watched for change not because he expected it, but because ignoring the possibility felt dangerous. Preparedness required awareness, and awareness left room, however small, for interruption. That is what made the preparation so complete and so fragile at the same time. It assumed continuity of hardship, but it did not eliminate the shock potential of disruption. The more thoroughly deprivation was normalized, the more destabilizing any deviation would become. By training himself to expect nothing, he unknowingly raised the emotional stakes of receiving anything at all. Thus, Chapter 1 is not merely about scarcity, but about the internal architecture built to withstand it. It is about how war reshapes rationality, teaching individuals to treat suffering as a constant rather than an aberration. It is about preparation as a moral posture, one that values endurance over expectation, control over hope. And it is about the quiet, disciplined acceptance of a future defined not by victory or defeat, but by how long one can continue with less than what is needed. In preparing for endless deprivation, he did not surrender. He adapted. But adaptation carried its own transformation, one that would later be challenged in ways he could not yet imagine. British involvement entered his world not as a moment of triumph or relief, but as a disruption to a carefully constructed reality. It arrived quietly, without spectacle, and for that very reason it felt unsettling. After years of conditioning himself to expect absence, the appearance of assistance registered first as a contradiction rather than a gift. His instincts, sharpened by prolonged uncertainty, urged caution. Anything that interrupted deprivation so abruptly demanded scrutiny, because in wartime, nothing arrived without consequence. At first, the signs were indirect. Rumors circulated before confirmation ever did, fragments of information carried by exhausted messengers and distorted by repetition. British support was spoken of not with confidence, but with tentative disbelief. Supplies, coordination, logistical adjustments, these were concepts that had begun to feel obsolete. The machinery of aid belonged to a different phase of the war, one defined by momentum rather than attrition. To hear that it might still function felt like encountering a relic that had inexplicably survived destruction. When the assistance became tangible, it did not immediately produce gratitude. Instead, it produced disorientation. His routines had been shaped by deprivation to such an extent that the presence of help threatened their internal logic. Decisions that once required strict calculations suddenly faced new variables. The mental frameworks that governed daily life, how much to eat, how much to save, how much to expect, were destabilized. British involvement did not simply add resources, It undermined the assumptions upon which survival strategies had been built. Suspicion followed naturally. Years of war had taught him that help was rarely unconditional. Assistance could be temporary, strategic, or symbolic. It could be withdrawn as quickly as it appeared. He questioned motives not out of cynicism, but out of survival instinct. Trust, like food, had become scarce. To rely too heavily on external support felt dangerous, especially when experience suggested that abandonment often followed dependency. The British presence also carried historical and political weight. It was not neutral. It represented power, distance, and a different wartime reality, one in which resources, though strained, still existed in meaningful quantities. This contrast sharpened awareness of inequality within the broader conflict. While some endured chronic deprivation, others possessed the capacity to intervene. That realization carried an emotional complexity that defied simple relief. Gratitude intertwined with resentment, admiration with unease. Logistically, the assistance introduced new rhythms. Deliveries followed schedules rather than chance. Systems began to reappear where improvisation had dominated. For someone accustomed to disorder, this predictability felt foreign. It demanded trust in processes rather than personal vigilance. He had learned to rely on himself because systems had failed. Now, systems were returning, and he was expected to reintegrate into them. Emotionally, this transition was more challenging than the deprivation itself. Hunger and exhaustion had been familiar adversaries. Uncertainty about help was a different kind of strain. The mind struggled to recalibrate expectations without exposing itself to disappointment. He found himself questioning not only the durability of British support, but his own capacity to accept it. Years of enforced self-reliance had reshaped his identity. Accepting aid felt like relinquishing a form of hard-earned autonomy. The community around him mirrored this ambivalence. Reactions ranged from cautious optimism to outright distrust. Some welcomed the assistance openly, interpreting it as validation that their suffering had not gone unnoticed. Others feared it would provoke retaliation or create dependencies that could not be sustained. Conversations became tense, charged with competing interpretations of what British involvement truly meant. Unity, already strained by deprivation, faced new pressures. British help also exposed psychological wounds that deprivation had suppressed. Scarcity had demanded focus, leaving little room for reflection. With the arrival of assistance, space emerged, space to think, to remember, to compare past expectations with present realities. This space was uncomfortable. It revealed how much had been lost, not only materially but emotionally. Relief did not erase trauma, it illuminated it. The moral dimension of the interruption became increasingly apparent. Deprivation had been endured under the belief that it was unavoidable, an impersonal consequence of war. British involvement challenged that belief. It suggested that suffering was not always the result of inevitability, but sometimes of delayed or absent intervention. This realization carried a quiet accusation, not directed at any individual, but at the structure of the war itself. He began to recognize that endurance, while necessary, had also been imposed. Preparation for endless deprivation had been rational, but it had also been a response to abandonment. British help reframed that abandonment, revealing it as contingent rather than absolute. The world had not forgotten entirely, it had simply arrived late. This lateness complicated gratitude. It raised questions that had no satisfying answers. Trust developed slowly, unevenly. Each delivery, each confirmation of continued support, chipped away at disbelief. Yet the fear of reversal never fully disappeared. He watched closely for signs of withdrawal, trained by experience to detect precursors of loss. Assistance was accepted, but rarely internalized as permanent. The psychological armor built during deprivation did not dissolve easily, it adapted instead, incorporating caution into relief. The interruption also altered power dynamics. Those distributing aid gained influence, intentionally or not. Decisions about allocation carried moral weight, determining who benefited first and who waited longer. Even well-intentioned systems introduced new hierarchies. British involvement did not eliminate hardship, it redistributed it. This redistribution required negotiation, patience, and restraint, qualities already eroded by prolonged strain. Despite these complexities, the presence of help gradually shifted emotional tone. Fear receded slightly, replaced by vigilance rather than despair. The constant calculation of survival eased just enough to allow moments of rest. These moments were fragile, easily disrupted by bad news or logistical setbacks, but they existed. For someone conditioned to expect none, their mere presence was transformative. Yet the interruption remained incomplete. British help did not restore what had been lost, nor did it erase the years of deprivation that preceded it. It functioned instead as a reminder that alternatives had always existed, even if they were inaccessible. This reminder was both comforting and painful. It validated endurance while questioning its necessity. In this phase, he stood between two realities. One was defined by endless deprivation, carefully prepared for and deeply internalized. The other was tentative, unstable, but undeniably present, a reality in which assistance could arrive, persist, and alter trajectories. British involvement forced him to inhabit both simultaneously, navigating a psychological borderland shaped by hope, restrained by memory. The interruption did not resolve the war's moral contradictions, it exposed them. It revealed how survival strategies born of neglect could be disrupted by care, and how such disruption carried its own emotional cost. British help was not a simple rescue. It was a challenge to assumptions, to identity, and to the belief that suffering was the natural order of things. Thus, Chapter 2 is defined not by relief, but by disturbance. It captures the moment when a life structured around deprivation encounters the possibility of support and must renegotiate its understanding of reality. The shock is not yet complete, but its foundations are laid. The interruption has begun, and with it, the slow unraveling of a worldview built to survive without help. As support expanded, its influence spread in ways that were neither immediate nor easily measured. The first changes were not dramatic improvements in living conditions, but subtle shifts in rhythm and perception. Time itself began to feel different. Days were no longer shaped entirely by emergency reactions. There were intervals, however brief, where urgency loosened its grip. These pauses were unfamiliar and, at times, unsettling. For someone long accustomed to operating under constant pressure, the absence of crisis felt almost like a mistake that needed correcting. Material effects followed a similar pattern. Supplies did not create abundance, but they reduced the edge of desperation. Hunger no longer dominated every waking thought, and exhaustion, though still present, lost some of its severity. This reduction was enough to change behavior. Movements became slightly less hurried, decisions marginally less defensive. These changes were easy to overlook, yet collectively they altered the emotional climate. Fear did not disappear, but it ceased to be the sole organizing force of life. Morale shifted unevenly. Some responded quickly, their spirits lifting as if long-suppressed optimism had simply been waiting for permission to re-emerge. Others reacted with restraint, unwilling to invest emotionally in conditions that might reverse without warning. He found himself somewhere in between. Relief was acknowledged intellectually, but emotionally filtered through years of disappointment. It was safer, he believed, to remain cautious than to be fully receptive. Experience had taught him that emotional exposure carried risk equal to physical vulnerability. The return of structure played a significant role in this transformation. British support brought with it systems, procedures for distribution, communication channels, and expectations of continuity. These systems did more than move supplies. They reintroduced predictability. Predictability, even in limited form, had a powerful psychological effect. It allowed the mind to anticipate rather than merely react. Anticipation, in turn, reopened cognitive space that had been closed by survival mode. This space was not immediately filled with hope. Instead, it filled with reflection. With fewer immediate threats demanding attention, memories surfaced more readily. He began to recall not only what had been lost, but how life had once been organized around different priorities. These recollections were bittersweet. They offered perspective but also sharpened awareness of how much deprivation had reshaped identity. The person he had become through endurance felt distant from the person he remembered being. The ripple effects extended beyond the individual. Social interactions grew more complex. Conversations expanded beyond logistics to include speculation, interpretation, and cautious planning. The community began to debate possibilities rather than merely manage shortages. This shift introduced tension. Differences in outlook became more visible. Those inclined toward optimism clashed with those committed to restraint. The question was no longer just how to survive, but how to respond to change. British support also exposed the psychological cost of prolonged scarcity. Under deprivation, emotional expression had been suppressed in favor of efficiency. With the easing of material pressure, suppressed emotions surfaced unpredictably. Some experienced relief followed by sudden waves of grief or anger. Others struggled with guilt, questioning whether accepting help invalidated their endurance or the sacrifices made during the worst periods. The presence of aid did not simplify emotions, it complicated them. At the moral level, this phase introduced profound tension. Deprivation had been framed as inevitable, a condition imposed equally by the war on all involved. The effectiveness of British support challenged that narrative. It demonstrated that intervention could meaningfully alter conditions, even late in the conflict. This raised uncomfortable questions. If change was possible now, had it been possible earlier? And if so, what did that imply about the years spent enduring preventable suffering? These questions did not demand immediate answers, but they lingered. They altered how past events were interpreted. Endurance, once seen purely as strength, acquired an additional dimension, necessity born of absence rather than choice. This realization did not diminish the resilience shown during deprivation, but it reframed it. Survival had been achieved not because suffering was unavoidable, but because help had been unavailable. He felt this tension personally. His identity had been built around endurance, self-discipline, and acceptance of loss. British support threatened to destabilize that identity by suggesting that endurance was not the only viable response. Accepting help required acknowledging vulnerability in a way that endurance alone did not. It meant recognizing limits not just of resources, but of isolation. The adjustment was gradual and uneven. Old habits persisted alongside new realities. He continued to ration instinctively even when supplies improved. He hesitated to rely on schedules, preferring contingency plans shaped by past unpredictability. These behaviors were not irrational, they were adaptive responses carried forward into a changing environment. The challenge lay not in abandoning them, but in recalibrating when they were no longer necessary. As systems stabilized, trust became a central issue. Trust in the continuity of support, trust in those administering it, and trust in the future itself. This trust developed incrementally, reinforced by consistency rather than promises. Each fulfilled expectation weakened the assumption that loss was inevitable. Yet complete trust remained elusive. Memory resisted erasure, reminding him that stability had been temporary before. The ripple effects of assistance also extended to how the war itself was perceived. It no longer felt like a monolithic force dictating all outcomes. The presence of effective intervention revealed fractures in that perception. The war appeared less as an unstoppable tide and more as a series of conditions shaped by decisions, timing, and access to resources. This shift in perspective was subtle but significant. It restored a sense of agency, not necessarily in shaping the war's outcome, but in understanding one's place within it. This restored agency, however, came with responsibility. If conditions could change, then responses mattered. Passivity, once a rational adaptation to powerlessness, now felt less justified. Individuals and communities began to reassess their roles, questioning whether endurance alone was sufficient or whether engagement with new systems was required. This reassessment was not unanimous or immediate, but it marked a departure from the resignation that had defined earlier periods. Emotionally, the transition was taxing. Living under deprivation had been painful, but it was coherent. Life followed a harsh but consistent logic. The introduction of assistance disrupted that coherence. Uncertainty shifted from, "Will things get worse?" to, "How long will this improvement last?" This new uncertainty demanded a different kind of resilience, one that balanced openness with caution. The moral tension deepened as comparisons emerged. Observing the tangible impact of British support forced a comparison between what was endured and what was now possible. This comparison was not merely economic or logistical, it was ethical. It highlighted disparities in suffering and the uneven distribution of relief. Such awareness could not be easily dismissed, and it influenced how gratitude, resentment, and reflection intertwined. Over time, the ripple effects accumulated. Small changes compounded into noticeable transformation. Not a return to normalcy, but a departure from constant crisis. This departure revealed how much of life had been structured around deprivation. The routines of scarcity had shaped values, relationships, and self-perception. As those routines loosened, space emerged for reevaluation. Yet even as conditions improved, the memory of deprivation remained active. It functioned as both warning and reference point. It prevented complacency while also underscoring progress. This dual role made the transition emotionally complex. Improvement was acknowledged, but never taken for granted. In this phase, the story moves beyond material change into psychological and moral territory. The ripple effects of assistance demonstrate that relief is not merely the absence of suffering, but the presence of alternatives. These alternatives challenge established identities and narratives. They force confrontation with the idea that endurance, while admirable, is not the only measure of strength. Chapter 3, then, is defined by recalibration. It captures the moment when assistance reshapes not just conditions, but consciousness. When fear loosens its hold just enough to allow reflection, and reflection reveals both loss and possibility. The shock has not yet fully manifested, but the groundwork is laid. The world is no longer governed solely by deprivation, and that realization carries consequences that extend far beyond the material realm. What followed did not announce itself with celebration or sudden transformation. Instead, it unfolded through persistence, and it was this persistence that unsettled everyone who witnessed it. British help did not arrive as a single gesture meant to reassure and then withdraw. It stayed. It adapted. It continued even when circumstances suggested it might falter. For those who had lived through years where every improvement was temporary and every promise fragile, continuity itself was the shock. At first, many assumed the assistance would peak and then diminish. War had conditioned them to expect cycles of hope followed by collapse. Temporary relief was familiar, sustained support was not. Each week that passed without withdrawal felt improbable. Each delivery that arrived on schedule quietly contradicted the belief that deprivation was the natural state of things. The absence of sudden reversal was disorienting. It challenged the emotional reflex to brace for loss at the first sign of stability. As support endured, systems once designed purely for survival were forced to evolve. Structures built to manage scarcity, strict rationing, rigid prioritization, constant contingency planning, began to feel excessive. Yet they did not disappear easily. They had been forged under pressure and carried moral authority. To dismantle them felt almost irresponsible, as though easing control might invite chaos back in. The community found itself caught between two instincts: the instinct to relax in response to stability and the instinct to maintain discipline forged in crisis. This tension revealed how deeply deprivation had shaped behavior. People were not simply short of resources. They had been shaped by years of lack into versions of themselves optimized for endurance, not recovery. The systems of survival had become identities. Efficiency had replaced empathy in decision-making. Emotional restraint had been praised as strength. Now, sustained assistance questioned whether those adaptations were still appropriate, or whether they had outlived their necessity. The shock intensified as it became clear that British support was responsive rather than rigid. It adjusted to needs, corrected inefficiencies, and responded to feedback. This adaptability contrasted sharply with the static nature of deprivation, where conditions worsened regardless of effort. The idea that systems could improve rather than merely persist felt radical. It suggested that suffering was not an unchangeable backdrop but a condition subject to management and reduction. With this realization came an unexpected discomfort. Stability exposed vulnerabilities that crisis had masked. Under deprivation, everyone shared the same baseline of hardship, which created a harsh but equalizing environment. Sustained help disrupted that balance. Differences in access, timing, and visibility of support became more pronounced. Questions of fairness resurfaced. Who benefited first and why? Who remained on the margins longer than others? These questions carried emotional weight because they replaced the blunt injustice of scarcity with the more complex ethics of distribution. For him, the persistence of help forced an internal reckoning. He had built his sense of competence around surviving without assistance. Endurance had been proof of worth. Now, as systems stabilized and needs were met more reliably, that proof felt less relevant. Strength was no longer measured solely by how much one could withstand, but by how well one could adapt to improvement. This shift was subtle but destabilizing. It required a redefinition of resilience. The continued presence of aid also altered perceptions of time. Deprivation had compressed time into short horizons defined by immediate needs. Sustained support expanded those horizons. Planning beyond the next day no longer felt reckless. The future, once abstract and threatening, began to take shape as a space where choices might matter again. This expansion was both liberating and intimidating. It demanded responsibility, foresight, and a willingness to imagine outcomes beyond mere survival. Emotionally, the shock lay in realizing how much had been internalized as permanent. People had not only accepted deprivation, they had organized their identities around it. Habits of suspicion, self-denial, and emotional restraint persisted even as conditions improved. British help did not erase these habits, it highlighted them. It revealed how survival strategies, once necessary, could become obstacles to recovery if left unexamined. The persistence of assistance also reframed the past. Endured suffering was no longer viewed solely as an inevitable chapter of war, but as a period shaped by delayed intervention. This reframing did not invalidate endurance, but it complicated its meaning. It introduced a sense of loss not only for what had been endured, but for what might have been avoided. This awareness carried a quiet grief that surfaced alongside relief. Trust evolved in response to consistency. Each fulfilled expectation weakened the assumption that help was temporary. Over time, vigilance softened, though it never fully disappeared. The memory of abandonment lingered, tempering optimism with caution. Yet even cautious trust marked a significant departure from the psychological isolation that had defined earlier years. It allowed cooperation to deepen and systems to function with less friction. As routines adjusted, emotional expression changed as well. Under constant deprivation, emotions had been compressed into manageable forms. With stability, they expanded unpredictably. Relief gave way to delayed grief, anger surfaced where resignation had once prevailed, and exhaustion manifested not only physically but emotionally. Sustained help created the conditions in which these responses could finally emerge. The shock was not only that help continued, but that it made visible the cost of having gone so long without it. Social dynamics shifted accordingly. Hierarchies established during scarcity, based on control of resources or information, lost some of their relevance. New forms of influence emerged, tied to coordination, communication, and cooperation. These changes were not seamless. They required renegotiation of roles and challenged those whose authority had been rooted in managing deprivation rather than facilitating recovery. British support, by persisting, forced a collective reconsideration of what normalcy meant. Normal was no longer defined by how much one could endure, but by how effectively systems could sustain life without constant crisis. This redefinition was profound. It suggested that the war, while still ongoing, no longer dictated every aspect of existence. Space opened for human agency within its constraints. The shock, then, was cumulative. It did not arrive as a single revelation, but as a series of confirmations that contradicted deeply held beliefs. Each day of continued support undermined the narrative of inevitability. Each adjustment reinforced the idea that deprivation had not been fate, but condition. This realization did not bring uncomplicated joy. It brought complexity, reflection, and a reckoning with the psychological architecture built to survive absence. By persisting, British help transformed interruption into influence. It altered not only material circumstances, but moral frameworks. It challenged the assumption that suffering was the default state and endurance the highest virtue. In doing so, it exposed the quiet cost of having believed otherwise for so long. This phase of the story is defined by endurance meeting continuity and being forced to yield. The shock was not that help arrived, but that it stayed long enough to change behavior, identity, and perception. It revealed that recovery is not a moment, but a process, and that process can be as unsettling as deprivation itself when it disrupts the truths people have lived by. With stability came something far more difficult than relief: reflection. The quiet that followed sustained support created space where the mind, long disciplined to focus only on immediate survival, began to wander backward and inward. During deprivation, reflection had been a luxury few could afford. Thinking too deeply about loss or injustice risked paralysis. Now, with the constant pressure eased, those suppressed thoughts surfaced with force. What emerged was not gratitude alone, but a complicated emotional reckoning. The first realization was exhaustion of a different kind. Physical fatigue had been familiar, measurable, and often unavoidable. Psychological fatigue revealed itself more slowly. Years of restraint, vigilance, and emotional suppression had accumulated unnoticed. When the necessity for constant alertness diminished, that accumulated strain demanded recognition. People felt tired not because conditions worsened, but because they finally had the capacity to feel how tired they had always been. Memories returned with clarity and weight. Events that had been processed only superficially during crisis now resurfaced in detail. Losses once acknowledged briefly and set aside for survival's sake demanded attention. Faces, places, moments of fear and compromise reappeared uninvited. Stability did not erase trauma, it activated it. The mind, no longer consumed by immediate threats, turned to unresolved experiences that endurance alone had not healed. He felt this acutely. His identity had been shaped around competence under pressure, the ability to function when conditions were worst. That competence had required emotional narrowing. Feelings that interfered with efficiency had been postponed indefinitely. Now, those feelings arrived without schedule or permission. Grief emerged not only for people lost, but for years spent in a state where grief had no place. Anger surfaced, not explosive, but persistent, directed at circumstances, decisions, and silences that had prolonged suffering. This stage introduced a quiet moral reversal. Endurance, once the highest virtue, began to feel incomplete. Surviving without complaint had been necessary, but it was no longer sufficient as a measure of strength. The willingness to acknowledge pain, to accept support, and to confront vulnerability now appeared equally important. This realization unsettled deeply ingrained beliefs. Strength had always meant suppression. Now it seemed to require openness. Guilt also emerged, subtle and corrosive. Some questioned whether accepting help diminished the sacrifices made during deprivation. Others wondered whether surviving when so many had not carried an unspoken moral burden. Stability forced comparisons that deprivation had postponed. When everyone suffered equally, comparison felt irrelevant. When suffering eased unevenly, it demanded explanation. Why relief now? Why survival here and not elsewhere? These questions had no satisfying answers, yet they could not be ignored. Relationships were affected as well. Bonds formed under deprivation had been based on shared endurance and mutual restraint. With stability, those bonds required renegotiation. Some people withdrew, uncertain how to interact outside crisis. Others sought connection more intensely, driven by delayed emotional needs. Misunderstandings increased. The shared language of survival no longer applied cleanly to a world where survival was no longer the sole objective. Emotionally, this phase was marked by contradiction. Relief coexisted with sadness. Safety existed alongside restlessness. The absence of immediate threat created a sense of emptiness rather than peace. Many discovered that crisis, for all its cruelty, had provided clarity. Every action had purpose. Every sacrifice had justification. Stability removed that clarity, replacing it with ambiguity and choice. Choice, after years of necessity, felt burdensome. He struggled with this ambiguity. During deprivation, his actions had been guided by external constraints. Now, internal judgment played a larger role. Decisions about how much to take, how much to save, how much to trust others, and how much to plan for the future demanded ethical consideration rather than instinctive reaction. This shift was mentally taxing. Freedom, even limited freedom, required skills that deprivation had not cultivated. The psychological architecture built for endurance began to show strain. Habits of suspicion persisted, even when they no longer served a clear purpose. He caught himself anticipating loss where none appeared imminent. These reflexes were not easily unlearned. They had once protected him. Letting go of them felt like abandoning armor in unfamiliar territory. The presence of sustained help also reframed perceptions of authority and responsibility. Under deprivation, authority had often been absent or ineffective, and responsibility had fallen disproportionately on individuals. With functioning systems restored, questions arose about accountability. Who was responsible for the years without help? Was deprivation simply a tragic byproduct of war, or the result of decisions made elsewhere? Reflection turned outward as well as inward, raising ethical questions that endurance had postponed. This moral inquiry was not accusatory in a simple sense. It was quieter, more personal. It involved re-evaluating narratives that had made suffering bearable. Stories of inevitability and sacrifice had provided meaning during deprivation. Stability challenged those stories. If relief was possible now, then inevitability was not absolute. This did not negate past endurance, but it complicated its meaning. Suffering had been real, but perhaps not unavoidable. The emotional cost of this realization was significant. It introduced a sense of loss not only for what had happened, but for what might have been prevented. This counterfactual grief was difficult to articulate. It did not fit neatly into categories of mourning or anger. It lingered as a quiet awareness that history could have unfolded differently. At the same time, reflection brought moments of unexpected compassion. For himself and for others, he began to recognize the limits of what individuals could control under extreme conditions. Survival had required compromise, silence, and adaptation that might appear troubling in retrospect. Stability allowed these actions to be examined with nuance rather than judgment. Understanding replaced some of the harsh self-criticism that emerged once danger receded. This phase also marked a shift in collective values. The community began to prioritize healing alongside reconstruction. Emotional needs, long dismissed as secondary, gained legitimacy. Discussions emerged about how to rebuild not only infrastructure but trust, identity, and moral coherence. These discussions were tentative and often uncomfortable, but they signaled a departure from survival-only thinking. British help, by creating the conditions for reflection, became more than material assistance. It functioned as a catalyst for moral and psychological reckoning. It forced confrontation with the long-term effects of deprivation that endurance alone could not resolve. The true cost of suffering became visible not when it ended, but when there was finally space to acknowledge it. He came to understand that survival had been only the first phase of recovery. The second phase required confronting what survival had demanded in return. Emotional numbness, moral compromise, and deferred grief were not signs of weakness. They were consequences of necessity. Recognizing them was not betrayal of endurance, but its continuation in a different form. This realization carried a quiet transformation. Strength was redefined not as the ability to endure without feeling, but as the ability to feel without collapsing. Acceptance of support became an act of courage rather than dependency. Reflection, though painful, became a path toward integration rather than fragmentation. Chapter 5 is defined by this internal turning point. It is the moment when stability exposes wounds rather than hides them, and when relief demands more than gratitude. It requires honesty, vulnerability, and a willingness to revise long-held beliefs about strength and survival. The moral reversal is subtle but profound. Endurance is honored, but it is no longer enough. Healing, reflection, and shared responsibility now take their place beside it, reshaping the meaning of what it truly meant to survive. In the aftermath, what remained was not a clear conclusion but a lasting shift in perspective. The experience no longer felt like a sequence of events defined solely by deprivation and relief, but like a lesson carved slowly into consciousness. Preparation for endless suffering had once seemed like wisdom, the most rational response to a world that offered no assurances. Now, with distance and reflection, that preparation appeared both necessary and tragically incomplete. It had protected life, but it had also narrowed the imagination of what life could be.